Hello everyone, this is Ashley Tucker. Thank you for joining me today. For today's card, I started with a piece of Canson watercolor paper taped down to a board. I'm going to be painting a very simple background using my Gonzai Tombi watercolors. I'm using 3 different shades of purple, which are color numbers 37, 139, and 38. The first thing that I do is I get my brush nice and wet, and I pick up the color and then add it to my palette. And then I add a little bit more water to it to water it down, and then I start painting so that I have a nice watered down color. I like to start with my colors watered down and slowly build up that color as I go. For this particular background, I want the color to be really dark in the end. So for this second layer, I'm not adding nearly as much water to the paint. I tried to keep my brush strokes very clean for this background, and I also tried to make sure that these 3 shades of purple blended together really well. Once I finished adding this second layer of paint, I used my heat tool to dry the background completely before adding a 3rd layer of paint. Using a heat tool to dry your paint does cause it to move a little bit, so those really even brush strokes that I was using aren't quite as clean anymore, but that's okay. I don't mind if it's a little bit uneven. That's what you get when you watercolor, and I like that look for watercoloring. Also, I really am too impatient to let it air dry. So you can see now that those colors are getting really dark, and that's good. That's what I wanted for this particular background. I used my heat tool to dry that 3rd layer of color, and then this background was all done, so I removed that tape very carefully. Next, I pulled out this stamp set by My Favorite Things called Which Way is the Candy, and there's 2 cute little pumpkin images in it that I'm going to be using. I stamped these pumpkins using my Misty tool with some Simon Says Stamp Intense black ink. This ink is a Copic friendly ink, and that's important because I'm going to be coloring these pumpkins in with my Copic markers. Next, I pulled out a Lawn Fawn stamp set. This stamp set is called Thanks a Bushel. It has a bunch of cute little faces in it, and I'm going to use 2 of those faces to stamp onto my 2 pumpkins. Once I finished stamping those, these pumpkins were ready to be colored. The coloring that I'm going to be doing on these pumpkins with my Copic markers is going to be some really easy Copic coloring. I have the 3 caps of my markers sitting on the side there so that you can see what colors I'm using. I started with my lightest color and colored in the top and the bottom of the pumpkin, leaving a little bit of white in the middle. And when I color those areas, I start with my marker tip at the outer portion of the pumpkin, furthest away from the center, and I bring my stroke towards the center in a flicking motion. So I started with the lightest color, and then I went to my medium shade, and then my dark shade, and then I worked back the opposite direction, going to my medium shade and then ending with my light shade. When I use my light shade at the very end, I fill in that white space that I left in the center. The reason that I leave that white space until the very end is to ensure that I get a really nice highlight there. Now, I didn't color these pumpkins in very realistically. I certainly wasn't thinking about a light source when I was doing my coloring. I think it's a really good thing to just color sometimes and not think too much about it. I know in the past I have thought way too much about it, and I actually stress myself out so much that I never even start coloring. So sometimes you just gotta color and not think. For the stems on the pumpkins, I used these 2 green colors, and there's not a whole lot to the coloring for those. They're very small. Next, I pulled out this Simon Says stamp set, and this is Simple Sentiments number 1, and I'm going to stamp one of the sentiments onto a piece of black cardstock using Versamark ink. I did prep that black paper with some of my powder tool so that none of the embossing powder will stick to anywhere where I don't want it to. So I embossed that using a white embossing powder, and then I used my tonic trimmer to trim it down to a small strip. So the sentiment that I chose says, "Love your guts," and I think it's going to work really well with these 2 pumpkin images. Because you know, when you turn a pumpkin into a jack-o'-lantern, you take out all of its guts. So like pumpkins, guts, I thought it would work. So I used my Tombow glue to adhere that sentiment strip onto a piece of vellum so that it'll have a nice little border around it. Next, I took my watercolor background and I popped it up onto a card base using a bunch of foam tape. I also popped up my sentiment with some foam tape onto the watercolor panel. Next, I'm going to adhere my two little pumpkins, and I'm using some foam tape to pop those up right underneath my sentiment. When I first placed them, I didn't push down all the way in case I needed to move them, but I didn't really need to move them, so after I placed them, I pushed them down to make sure that they were nice and adhered. After I placed my pumpkins, I realized that I really wanted them to be more grounded. So I took my black Prismacolor pencil and I added a little bit of a drop shadow underneath them. Now they look like they're sitting on the ground instead of just floating in space. Next, I pulled out my white gel pen and I added a bunch of highlights onto my pumpkins. I love adding highlights with my white gel pen to my colored in images. I think that it really changes them in such a big way, and it's a good way. I pulled out my T-square ruler and I used my white gel pen to add a border around the edge of the watercolor panel. I made sure to hold my T-square ruler right up against that watercolor panel so that I could get really straight lines. I pulled out a bunch of really tiny star sequins, and these are clear star sequins, and I spread them out across the top of the card to look like stars in the sky, and then I glued them down using my Tombow glue. I pulled out my Wink of Stella glitter brush and I added some sparkle to my sentiment strip, and then this card was all done. Thank you for watching today. I hope you really enjoyed this Halloween themed Love You card. All of the supplies that I used today can be found in the description down below. If you enjoyed watching and you're not a subscriber yet, I would encourage you to hit that subscribe button so that you can see all of my future videos. I'm going to be back with a new video on Wednesday. Again, thank you for watching. I really appreciate all of you, and I hope you have a great day today.